Okay, I think we're going to make a start. Welcome to the last session of the opening day of the main part of Undisciplining. Really thrilled to be launching one of our sociological review monographs, the Sociology of Stigma, today. And as you can see, we have a significant number of the authors who are present with us today. Before I start with the introductions, just in terms of housekeeping, all of the authors are apparently thrilled if you would like to tweet about them, live blog about them, take their photographs, stream images of them, indeed do anything you want digitally with them within reason over the next 2 hours. So please do feel undisciplined and unleashed digitally. Okay, I'm going to start with some brief introductions. We've got 2 hours. What we're going to do is talk initially. Each of the authors is going to talk a little bit about their papers and about the contribution it makes to this statement about thinking about stigma. Imogen, as one of the two editors, is going to talk a little bit about the project as a whole, as well as her contribution. I should say before we start, we are all of us missing the absence of Tom Slater, who has literally fallen down a rabbit hole, not metaphorically or epistemically, but literally, and so unfortunately can't be with us today. Okay, so by way of introductions, my name's Steve Brown. I'm the editor in charge of Monographs with Sociological Review.
Virgílio Borges Pereira from the University of Porto.
Actually, I'm João Queiroz. Phonetically, it's very easy, although in writing it's more difficult to spell.
Hi, I'm Tracy Shildrick, Newcastle University.
I'm Christine Payton from the University of Liverpool.
I'm Lisa Morris from the University of Birmingham.
Joanna Latimer from the University of York.
Imogen Tyler from Lancaster University.
I'm Jenna Lloyd. I'm from University of Wisconsin-Madison.
And I'm Stephen Crossley from Northumbria University, and I'm responding to the authors. I'm not an author of any of the papers.
Thank you very much, and beautifully to hear those names done properly and in the right order. Okay, I just want to say a couple of things just about the Monograph series. One of the unique things about Sociological Review is since the mid-1950s, we've been publishing a monograph, which is an edited collection alongside the regular issues of the journal. It's the name Monograph itself is a little bit confusing and has confused more than one proposal that we've had come to us. The idea really of the monographs is that they're not simply a special issue. It's not simply a themed collection. It's trying to do something different. So in a standard special issue, the guest editors work within the orbit of the journal, whereas I like to think of these monographs as more a kind of editorial takeover, if you like, of 2 issues of the journal. So they have a unique status as both regular articles within the journal and then as a standalone book, which I'm delighted to say we have almost no copies of left today, but rest assured we have many more copies available should you wish to have your own copy of this monograph. So the monographs are trying to do something a little bit different within the context of the journal, and I think they're trying to take risks. They are trying to do that. They're a space where we can experiment with thinking differently sociologically. They're a space where we can not necessarily be so constrained by the usual format of the journal and think differently about how to organise arguments. And I think the monographs that we publish tend to do that in one of 2 different ways. The first thing that they try to do, many of the monographs, is introduce new concepts. And if you have a look at the gorgeous array of monographs that we have outside, if you look at things like waste matters or at laws of the market or at market devices, all of these have tried to introduce new concepts into the sociological lexicon. And some of those concepts are inherently interdisciplinary. Some of those concepts have almost become a discipline within themselves. I like to think that laws of the market really has a pivotal place in cultural economy, for example, as a disciplinary area. In the same way, actor network theory, I think, owes a lot to the monograph series in its current form. But then there's another kind of risk-taking, which is every bit as uncertain. And that risk-taking is to take concepts that already exist within the sociological lexicon and to think not simply about rethinking them or revisiting them, but reimagining them. What is it that this concept, how to turn that concept inside out, how to think about it differently in our contemporary context. And if you look at the work that's been done around, say, the Elias volume that we published a number of years ago, I think that was very much not simply updating things, but turning things on their head in some ways. I like to think that the current monograph is very much within that second version of risk-taking. So it's not simply about what would Goffman be saying now. This is about rethinking entirely what that historical legacy is that comes from Goffman, but indeed rethinking the nature of that historicity, how we even think about the historical trajectory of the concept of stigma. So I'm going to pass over now to Imogen, perhaps if you want to say a little bit about the volume as a whole.
Feels a bit like a karaoke, Mike. So I guess this, for me, and also, of course, working with Tom, one of the things we wanted to do was to kind of bring together the work Tom's been involved with on territorial stigma, and that's been very influential in geography, in gentrification, thinking about urban studies. So thinking about stigma of place and how that's developed or pushed forward understandings of stigma. And my own interests in stigma, which I kind of guess emerge in particular about how to think about the neoliberalism and austerity, for example. So how can we think about the role of stigma, for example, in legitimating the sorts of welfare reform we've seen since 2010. So this comes out in particular in my work, working with Tracy Jensen and others on things like poverty porn, television, the kind of demonising representations of people living on benefits, etc. And it's really clear that there's a kind of cross media, governmental campaign that produces stigma from above as a kind of governmental strategy or technique to legitimate welfare, cuts to welfare, and the devastating impacts that we know that has had on British society. So I guess it's really this interest for me is coming out of, well, you know, we hear a lot about stigma in sociological research. So writing, for example, about food banks or what's happened to disabled people as a consequence of cuts. We hear a lot of people talking to sociologists about stigma, and we hear a lot about changes to policy having stigmatizing effects. And in part, that's partly my interest, but part of my interest is slightly more theoretical or conceptual, which is looking upwards to think about where stigma is being produced, by whom, for what purposes. So it's trying to take, in a way, a slightly more structural approach to thinking about how the relationship between capitalism and stigma production. And thinking about stigma as a particular form or technology of power and government. So that's the sorts of questions I was thinking about when I started to return to thinking about the genealogy of stigma as a concept within sociological thinking. And also, as part of that, the way in which anti-stigma initiatives function. So in the introduction to the special issue, the case study I think through in order to think about these questions is the Heads Together campaign, which, as you may know, is fronted by some younger members of the royal family and is a campaign about diminishing the stigma associated with mental health. So its tagline is something like, you know, talking about getting rid of stigma by talking. And that's a very familiar trope within charitable campaigns around stigmatized conditions. And one of the things I started to think about is, okay, if we start thinking about stigma more as a political economy, how might we also think about anti-stigma campaigns and their limitations? So I did some work on the Heads Together campaign that looked at who was funding it, what it's kind of, how it practiced and worked, who was funding it, For example, Virgin Money, Virgin Health, of course, and other brands of Virgin is profiting from this privatisation of health services that have a direct impact on people's access to mental health services, but also how neoliberalism itself produces mental distress. So what's the context in which, if you like, a campaign like that emerges and becomes the focus of kind of national public attention? So how can we think about stigma and anti-stigma campaigns in the context of these more political and economic questions? So I call it, and this is using a term from one of my colleagues, Bob Jessup, trying to think about stigma as a kind of cultural and political economy, but for me in particular that involves kind of looking upwards to, in a sense, asking what is stigma for? And asking that question, which is a bit of like the question Bev asked the other day, asking those bigger questions about what's stigma for, who's producing it, and why. And then I guess, so that's how the volume is kind of set up in the introduction. And then, of course, to think about stigma in sociology means thinking about Goffman to some extent, okay? So if you read through, which I have, because I'm writing another book on, the whole book on stigma as well, you have to return to Goffman, but also look at the kind of citational power of Goffman and the power of Goffman in shaping contemporary understandings of what stigma concept is and what it means. And I had actually read Goffman's book on stigma before I began this bigger research project on stigma. And I didn't think it was very good, which might be a controversial thing to say. But, you know, it's obviously very important, and he gave us some key things about thinking about stigma relationally, thinking about stigma as a kind of intersectional concept, but we can return to the limits of that. But what's really absent from his account is any notion of stigma as power and any notion of history. And what I decided to do in kind of tackling Goffman critically was to resituate his account, and this is the first chapter in the book, is to resituate Goffman's account in 1963 when it was published. It's a book that sold 800,000 copies. It's a book really that's the foundational text of disability studies. I mean, it's incredibly influential. And I really wanted to resituate Goffman in the political context of 1963 at Berkeley, where he was teaching a course from which that book emerged, the lecture notes from which it emerged, and to resituate it in the context of civil rights and the black struggles around stigma that were taking place in interactional contexts that he was so interested in, cafes, buses, swimming pools, all the sort of contexts that Goffman is so interested in as a theorist, as a micro-sociologist of the interaction, and to kind of use black sociology, by which I mean not only black sociology written from within the canon or written within black sociological departments in the south of the US at that time, but also manifestos, art, literature, other types of black sociological thinking, to really take on Goffman and take on his account of stigma, and really in particular for me, put racism at the absolute centre of our understandings of stigma and anti-stigma struggles as political struggles that were taking place at the time, and ones which Goffman completely ignored. And what that does, I think, is transforms our understanding of stigma as a form of politics, as a site of struggle, and as a kind of political economy. And there's just one anecdote from that, which I came across while I was doing the research, which was an account written by Gary Marks, who's now quite a well-known sociologist who works on surveillance in particular, who wrote in an issue, I think it was of Culture, Fear and Society, or one of those journals when Goffman died, on his death, about being taught by Goffman at Berkeley, and about being in a class where a black student, unnamed, stood up or put his hand up and said, "This is all very well, Professor Goffman, but what does your theory tell us? You know, how can it change the world? What does it actually do to change the world?" And I've got that quote wrong, but it's something like that. And Goffman said, "I'm not into that business," and slammed down his books and walked out the room. So there's a real sense in which the civil rights movement, the struggles that were going on in the US in '63, and we're, of course, at Berkeley on campus itself, were kind of leaking into Goffman's own classroom. And for me, bringing those in now is a way for us to rethink stigma in a way that it might have critical and theoretical teeth for thinking about the things that we face now in contemporary society. So that's kind of my segue in. And this volume was a kind of, because I'm doing this bigger project on stigma, which will be coming out in a book next year called Stigma Machines. This volume was a chance for me to invite people I wanted to work with and Tom wanted to work with to kind of contribute, give us ideas, and for us to work with to produce a kind of collective volume first, to kind of try and push forward the critical and political meaning that the stigma might have as a useful tool for thinking about questions of power, inequality, and injustice.
Thanks, Imogen. So we'll hear from some of the authors now. So can I pass over to Virgilio?
I would like to start by thanking Imogen Taylor and Tom Slater for inviting us to participate in the production of this very interesting monograph. Our gratitude goes also to the organizing committee of this conference and to the Sociological Review for the invitation to be here at this launching event. With our article entitled Voices in the Revolution, Resisting Territorial Stigma and Social Relegation in Porto's Historic Center, 1974-1976, we wanted to give a contribution to the broadening of the research agenda on territorial stigmatization based on in-depth sociological research about the reproduction of the social space of the city of Porto in the north of Portugal. To do that, we elaborated a set of theoretical arguments on the relevance of a relational sociological reading of the processes of territorial stigmatization, and we proposed a study of these processes during a period of political revolution and social instability through the discussion of the case presented by the city of Porto in the mid-1970s. I would like to briefly highlight the theoretical and methodological aspects of our work, and João will follow me and will present some major results and implications of this specific research. Theoretically speaking, this research mobilizes the legacy of Irving Goffman's work on stigma and tries to expand it with the inscription of a Bourdieu-inspired relational reading of the links between the institutional mechanisms of social reproduction and the agents' strategies of social reproduction in the social space of the city. Besides a specific worry with the struggles of classification that involve both sides of the processes of reproduction here in question, the use of Pierre Bourdieu's analytical framework also meant to work with Loïc Vacan's reformulation of Goffman's Durkheim-inspired analysis of the interaction order, and to take space, its uses and representations as anchors of social discredit. Among social agent strategies of material and symbolic investment, those that aim to confront territorial stigma may take on relatively plural configurations and purposes, since they are the products of the mode of reproduction in which they occur and reflect the relations between the volume, composition, and potential of the capitals of those putting them forward. Life in physically and socially disadvantaged environments is often the object of simplistic readings. With the proposed analytical lenses, our reading of these processes in the city of Porto showed that life in the most underprivileged neighborhoods of the city is usually more complex than expected, both socially and symbolically. In previous researches, we had already explored the significance of exit strategies and the relevance of the reproduction of micro-differences among deprived social housing dwellers. In this article, we propose to study strategies of resistance. To do so, we had to return to history, which is in itself a sociological meaningful fact, since collective resistance to territorial stigma is nowadays more difficult to be developed in contexts such as these. And to return to the 1970s, a revolutionary period informed, nevertheless, by heavy social and political inequalities in the country and in the city. In epistemological and methodological terms, the extended case method and short-time sociohistory were employed to historically reconstitute protests and daily experiences in the city's socially disadvantaged neighborhoods. Based on the study of institutional archives, ethnographic work in several neighborhoods, and semi-structured interviews with social actors involved in these processes, the article identifies the urban and housing conditions of inner-city Porto's working-class boroughs in the first 3 quarters of the 20th century and analyzes the forms of political and social resistance taken up by residents from the most dilapidated neighborhoods following the Revolution of April 1974. In the period under study, the conditions of possibility of this resistance were far from being easily gathered. It was thus important to identify the conditions of possibility here in question. The sociological analysis of the actions that gave origin to the voice of the residents in the historic center of the city in this period reveals significant interaction with the process of territorial stigmatization via organized collective resistance. João will speak now about some of the properties of our findings.
Well, thank you very much. I'll need just a couple of minutes to highlight here what we believe are 2 or 3 relevant topics or implications of our socio-historical appraisal of collective resistance to social relegation and territorial stigmatization in 1970s post-revolutionary Porto. These are issues of we believe, of potential interest not only for those studying stigma and territorial stigmatization, but also for those committed to urban and social change, informed by consistent sociological knowledge. Well, the first point deals with determinism, or with some sort of a critique of structural determinism. Against structural determinism, what we'd like to stress here is that the ways in which social agents deal with negative images attached to their place of living and therefore to themselves emerge in a dialectic, fluid fashion as a result of the encounter between specific systems of dispositions and sets of resources and specific structures of opportunities and constraints. Although the probability of success when participating in the struggles for the representation and appropriation of space typically increases as the amount and variety of capitals possessed increase, like Bourdieu would put it. Our paper shows that under certain historical and social conditions, even the most decapitalized and stigmatized socio-spatial settings can be the locus of political engagement and active organized resistance to social relegation and territorial stigmatization. The second point is intimately linked to this one and concerns the complex and diverse nature of social relations and everyday life in this impoverished and stigmatized social-spatial settings. In spite of physical deterioration and negative reputation, and contrary to the illusion of homogeneity forwarded by dominant depictions and discourses, we find it's common for residents in these kind of areas to value their places of living and everyday dwelling for anchoring significant social relations and dense webs of friendship and reciprocal support. And like Loic Vacan would put it, these areas remain, in fact, and I'm quoting, communal places bathed in shared emotions and joint meanings, supported by practices and institutions of mutuality instead of indifferent spaces of mere survival and relentless contest. And this is very important for the production of an autochthonous, a local discourse, and eventually of locally based action. The third and last point has to do with issues of representation and democratic mediation and class alliance. The case presented in our paper is clear, we believe, in stressing the importance of the presence and work of intellectuals, activists, and members of different public bureaucracies in the creation, with local residents, of a local alternative representation and prospect of impoverished and stigmatized working class territories. The question here has to do with how professionals of representation, such as academics, can contribute to favor change in the symbolic structures that produce and legitimate inequality and marginality in the city, and act as mediators, this way helping to include different social perspectives in the process of political decision-making in the city, and thus helping advance public policies designed to fight material deprivation as well as symbolic domination in urban settings. Thanks.
Imogen invited me to come and speak about my chapter, which she said it'd be easy, you know, you wrote it, and I got this wave of fear because a colleague had asked me the key arguments just a few days ago, and I got myself in such a tangle in trying to explain what they were, and it's because I need to explain the genesis of this piece, and it comes from previous research that I did in Glasgow with Jerry Mooney and Vicky McCall, and a project called Beyond Stigma. And we were looking at the Commonwealth Games then, and trying to understand in terms of gentrification and territorial stigmatisation, which we were discussing, and how the Commonwealth Games was a vehicle to realise this in Glasgow's East End, how they're too not regenerated, previous kind of programmes have failed there, so it's like last chance saloon, we'll get the Commonwealth Games, we'll give them a velodrome. So we were interested in looking at how this was being received and negotiated and resisted, looking beyond stigma in the neighbourhood there. And we were looking to try and understand, well, as Skeggs was discussing yesterday, you know, the accumulation through dispossession and how stigmatisation is an important precursor in that, and helping to realise land value and rent gap by devaluing people who are living there and devaluing that neighbourhood. So looking at the connection between social and spatial objection, and how stigma was really expediting those processes of devaluation to open up that rent gap. And why this was particularly significant, and Imogen mentioned the connection to kind of welfare and conditionality, is that when these processes fail, then the local community are blamed for that, and then it justifies further retrenchment of welfare. Like, we give you a velodrome, we give you Commonwealth Games, and you didn't find, you know, redemption, and you didn't become a productive like citizen. So it just justified that in an area that's got high like levels of welfare recipients. And forgive me, because if you've heard me discuss this paper before, because you'll know this scene, and it's like a primal scene, as Les Back calls it, and it's a kind of single vivid moment that opens up your research. And I sketch it in the paper, which is, the story goes, and we heard this story a lot, that an athlete during the Commonwealth Games runs into a newsagent shop in Kilmarnock, clutching a map, and says, "I'm in the red zone. I need to get out of the red zone. It's a danger zone." And the shopkeeper takes the map and realises that their shop in Kilmarnock is in this red zone, and it's been designated to the athletes that they shouldn't go into this area and they shouldn't visit it. And this kind of chimes with the shopkeepers. They think, well, that makes sense. We didn't have this trickle down that we were supposed to get with the games. And so we heard this story again and again. People had seen the map, they had the map, like, we know all about the map. And so we tried to get this map, and we used freedom of information requests, other such things, and it didn't exist. There was no map. It was a parking map that had a red kind of like zone on it. But what was really interesting about it was the fact that this myth originated in the neighbourhood itself by the people that were living there in the East End, and it showed how they were embodying stigma. This was this primal scene for that article, but it's a partial scene because it doesn't explain stigma for whom and why. It's saying it's been embodied, but who's producing it and who's profiting from it. So this chapter is a kind of revision and kind of sequel to that. So I mean, the title itself is Beyond Legacy, Backstage Stigmatisation and the Trickle-Up Politics of Regeneration. And I was trying to kind of change that focus of gazing down, see who's been stigmatised, to gazing up, who profits, and also challenging that idea that anything trickles down when we know it trickles up the way. So it was trying to kind of explore that and taking Goffman's notion of backstage to try and do that and really see what's the political economy behind the games and who profits. So there's plenty of stories within that, and just to give you kind of a flavour of it, there was a lot of ways in which kind of local government profited, and the local Labour Council did. There was one MSP, Labour MSP, Ronnie Sayes, who was in charge of the Glasgow East End kind of regeneration scheme, and it got consolidated. There was 4 of them into one scheme. And he got a payoff of £500,000 and another £40,000 and a big bump up to his pension. And then all of a sudden, money that was earmarked for a school in Kilmarnock disappeared. So it was this poor kid's cash that he got through this and kind of paid off. And then there was all sorts of money deals about land that was earmarked when the council knew that the games was going to happen, and the selling of land with like a London Mayfair property firm, Charles Price. There's lots of shady land deals that went on. But also, just to mention the corporate sponsorship, I don't know how aware you are of this, but there was a lot of really kind of ethically kind of questionable sponsors of the games. BP, drones manufacturers, Celix S, or ES, and G4S as well, the security firm. But one of the most controversial was Atos, the outsourcing conglomerate I'm sure you're familiar with, for the Department of Work and Pensions, who were responsible for carrying out assessments for those who were kind of sick and disabled, and kind of reassessing people so they lost their benefits. So this plunged thousands of people into poverty, these assessments, and there's a real nasty irony, given that the East End itself has got some of the highest kind of recipients of these benefits who were having them reassessed and losing this money. And the whole game's legacy is premised on health and well-being. That's the whole thing. Make the East End healthy and well. And yet this company itself, which is doing this, is causing greater harm to those local residents in the way that they're reassessing. And yet they skip out of town with money that they make and profits that they make from the games. So these are just a kind of few examples of how we kind of demonstrate the political economy behind that stigma. And I guess the argument that I was trying to make in contributing to this volume was how we have to kind of expose the political economy of stigma. It's a kind of the critical reading that sociology of stigma has been lacking so far, and it brings that hidden and backstage, central stage, and casts a kind of spotlight on that, so we can see these the processes of power and kind of violence and injustices that it brings.
I think the genesis of mine is slightly different to everybody else's, because this is my paper's on something that I haven't researched myself before. So my PhD was about something totally different. But it comes from a period of 18 months that I spent as a research fellow working on 2 national projects in England, looking at the process of the family court and the state-ordered removal of children from their families. One of the projects was particularly on mothers, so mothers is the focus of my paper. And what happened was I was in the archive, so I spent these 18 months working mainly on my own in the family court buildings, also in social work offices, reading accounts of mothers and their children, which was I didn't really realise how emotional it was going to be at the time, but it was a very emotional experience, reading about, seeing photographs of the families, reading psychological reports, and perhaps the most traumatic was in between the typed bureaucratic psychiatric psychological reports were fragments of paper with handwritten letters from mothers and grandmothers pleading with the family court judge to let them have their children. So what happened after that, as I was going about my daily business, I began to be haunted by the stories of the women and the children. And everywhere I looked, like I'd be on a bus and I'd see children who were a similar age to the stories I've been reading about. And I would start to think, are they the children? So to kind of deal with this, I started to read work about hauntology, and Avery F. Gordon's work spoke to me. So my paper's called Haunted Futures, the Stigma of Being a Mother Living Apart from Her Children as a Result of State-Ordered Court Removal. So what I began to realise is that not only was I haunted, but one could explain the experiences of the mothers of also being haunted. They were haunted, so I began to read as well a blog written by somebody called Annie about her experience of her children being removed, and also a project called Women Living Apart from Their Children, which is in Leeds. And I began to read the stories of the mothers, and I sort of made sense of them, that they were living for an imagined future, a time of when they would be reunited with their children, of course a time that may never actually come. So I began to see that not only were they their past and presents were affected by stigma, that actually their futures were also stigmatized. This also came into the case of, so when you've had one child removed or two child removed, the next time you get pregnant, you stand a very good chance of that child being removed, and we actually, as part of the project, showed that statistically as well. So that's not just me claiming that. So babies can be removed at birth. So you haven't actually done anything to harm that baby at all, because that baby's never been with you. So Annie has had previous children removed, and she's had her newborn baby forcibly taken from her under a court order when she was in the maternity ward. She was then sent home in a taxi without her 4-day-old baby. She was alone, she was bleeding, her breasts were leaking milk. In her blog, Surviving Safeguarding, she writes, "It was like a death every time I had to leave my baby after contact. It was like I was grieving whilst my child was still alive. I was trying to keep fighting." And she remembers, "I was looking outside at the sky and knowing my children were under it, but that was all I knew." So I think if we think about the events that's happening in America right now, where children are being separated from their families, these mothers, they don't even know where their children are. They don't even know if their names have been changed. They know they're just waiting for a time where they hope that they'll be reunited with the children. And what they say is, this is a quote from somebody, the mothers living apart from their children, "We aren't classed as mothers. We have no rights. We don't feel we have a job as a mum anymore. Our homes are dead. But being a mum never goes away in our hearts and mind. We have feelings, we have a heart, shock, anger, emotion, crying, powerlessness. Where are they now? We have to know in some way that we're still here for them." So this is, so they might have contact with the children through something called letterbox contact, which is like a letter, basically, once a year, which obviously is very hard to write and also to receive. And so one of the mothers writes, "I've just received a letter from my youngest daughter who's been adopted. She told me she looks like the princess from Disney's Tangle. She can write her own name, she knows her colours, she can ride a bike. Now when I'm out, I find myself searching with a little girl with blonde hair. Social services won't let me have the photographs the foster carers took of her." So she is, you can tell that she's visibly or serially haunted by this imagined idea of her daughter, but she has no idea what she looks like, only from a cartoon. So what I'm saying is that actually stigma is also a part of the future, and it's also to do with silencing. So because of the nature of being through the family court, most judgments are not published, and when they are, they are anonymised. And when you've been part of that system, you're not allowed to speak out. You are silenced by the idea that if you were to go against it, you would probably have your next child removed. But also, they have reporting restrictions, which means that Annie cannot use her own name. She's not allowed to, because it might identify her children. So she has to be known as Annie. And what what happened is that her older son, who'd always lived with her actually, he actually died suddenly. She can't even name him. So she wrote, "I would not, could not have started writing without the support of my oldest son. Because there remains for now a reporting restriction order in place forbidding me, I cannot tell you his name, although I dearly, dearly long to. I have no choice for now to refer to him as Peter." So what I argue is that this is a testimonial quieting, as Dotson said, and her very life is diffused with state power. So when Imogen's talking about how power is working, it's working in this way. And I do actually go on to be a bit more hopeful, because basically what's happening is the services for these families have been decimated because of austerity, as Tracy's saying. But what Avery Gordon says is that ghosts, while they do signify a traumatic loss, they also simultaneously represent hope and future possibilities of transformation through the telling of alternative stories. And these alternative stories can make visible how structural inequalities and policies such as austerity impacts on the lives of the most vulnerable families in the UK. And what I argue is people like Annie telling their stories, it disrupts the idea, or it tells us what's going on. We didn't, some of us didn't realise what was happening to these families. I mean, we see it visually in America, but imagine that is happening a lot. And I argue that the groups like the Mothers Living Apart from Their Children project, where you've got women coming together to tell their stories, that actually that collectivity fosters what Imogen Tyler calls the maternal commons, where actually they can start to say, I shouldn't feel ashamed. I'm not just a bad mother. It's actually, if I'd had help, maybe my child could have stayed with me. And this is a poem about the group, being part of the group. In the stillness we listen, her words splintered with tears. They hold each other, laugh, cry. They use ordinary magic to keep the room safe. They're strong and clever women who understand what it is to be broken. Thank you.
When people are very old and deteriorated and no one enters their world and they're just sitting there, they will withdraw inward more and more. And their desperate need for connection is all now inside. And if a person is all alone, even if they're very, very deteriorated, there's a longing for this kind of closeness. Mrs. Wilson? Hello. You want me to sit? Can you see me good? Gladys Wilson is a wonderful example of a person who is in the phase of repetitive motion, where people use movements, repetitive movements, because they don't have any more speech or very little speech. But they have human needs that need to be expressed. Can you open your eyes now? Do you see me? Feel safe and warm? Yes? Can you sing with me? He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hand. He's got the whole world in his hand. He's got the mothers and the fathers. He's got the mothers and the fathers in his hand. He's got the mothers and the fathers in his hand. He's got the whole world in his hand. The breakthrough doesn't happen every time. The person will not always open their eyes and look at you. But if you keep trying and you keep centering yourself and really look at that person and really mirror their movements, maybe not this time, but the next time you come, you'll have a communication. You feel safe. You feel safe? Yeah. With Jesus? Yeah. And me?
Thank you, Imogen, Tom, with your ankle, Sociological Review, for inviting me to contribute to the volume. So in the paper, I sort of think with people like Gladys, and I have to say with Naomi, maybe not enough with Naomi, with her wonderful spirit as she gets inside Gladys's world. So I think about how in the sort of 21st century, aging has become monstrous for us, how there are actor networks of public health, cultures of consumption around anti-aging. You can't go in a shop without coming out with a bit of DNA cream or something like that. You can't go for a walk in the park without thinking, is this doing me good? Yeah, is it helping me stay younger for longer? So I sort of think with Gladys and with people like Gladys who I've looked after in the past, and I think about the biopolitics, the contemporary biopolitics that we're living in. And I took up Imogen's invitation to think about this in terms of stigma. So with Imogen and Bev and Steph Lawler and a few other wonderful writers, I think about stigmatization as itself a process, as a political process. So I draw on Zygmunt Bauman's notion of, which he's taking from Levi-Strauss, which is the idea of the anthropoemic and the anthropophagic, as two strategies through which societies or communities deal with the otherness of others. So I talk about how on the one hand there's this sort of parade of monsters, of zombies, of the aging dementia relation, which is kind of intruding into all of our lives. So every time you turn the television on, there's a Wallander losing his mind, or somebody in The Missing. These are British television programs on the BBC, or in The Archers, yeah, becoming a non-person. So I think about the dementia-aging relation in terms of the anthropoemic as something which is the sort of spirits that we want to sequestrate, destroy, keep out, get away from us. And that's one way in which stigmatization is working. And I think the way in which I'm trying to think about stigmatization in the paper can be applied to many, many forms of stigmatization. And I was thinking of your paper yesterday morning. And then the second, perhaps more sort of STS way of working that I think about the strategy is actually the anthropophagic, which is where we try and turn this otherness into the sameness. We kind of eliminate it through this sort of phagocyte activity. So I think about the way in which, on the one hand, you've got this stigmatization of the aging dementia relation across the world, yeah, as costing us so much money, yeah. So there's that on the one hand, and then on the other hand, there's an alliance or an association between many, many different discourses which locate us individually as responsible for managing our aging, for preventing our aging. So instead of looking at Gladys and thinking of Gladys actually as a very, very poor Afro-American woman living in an institution, yeah, in place where her dementia itself may be relational, who knows? Yeah, we don't know. I start to think about how we're all being emplaced in order to not become Gladys. Yeah, so that's the second strategy. So there's biomedicalization going on. There's this culture of anti-aging culture of consumption that aligns with this biomedicalization, which also aligns with the public health discourses. You just have to choose to live the right way. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I'm feeling the power of all of these pieces. And so I hope to generate some energy as feeling a lot of the violence and structural violence that's been described and been analyzed. And so I'm feeling that at the moment. And I have more to talk about with that regard. With a co-author of mine, Ann Bonds, we're both geographers. We authored a piece that starts with a question. The question is, where do Black Lives matter? The answer to the question, as we know, should be that everywhere. But what we were confronted with in living in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, was a particular moment in time that we're still living through, I think now, perhaps even more pronounced, where there's a sustained, and I would say decades long, really, and more pronounced now, crisis, a dual crisis, around racialized poverty within the city, and the surrounding suburbs, which are predominantly white. So the city of Milwaukee is divided, more so than any city I've ever lived in, racially and class divided. And so the north side of the city is predominantly African American, south side is more Latino or Latinx, and the east side near the Lake Michigan, which is quite beautiful, is predominantly Anglo or white Americans. And then the surrounding suburbs are much wealthier and 98 to 99% white and much more conservative. So there's a geopolitics of the Milwaukee metropolitan region. So there's been a sustained political crisis over racialized poverty within Milwaukee for some time and within the entire state for some time, that goes along with a sustained crisis over policing that has become much more pronounced on a broader scale with the Black Lives Matter movement. So of course the answer to the question should be everywhere, but yet we had a mayor who's a white, continues to be the mayor of Milwaukee, who after an uptick of murders within the city stated, at some point, somebody has to say, to stop and say that Black Lives Matter. And so that was meant to be read as this liberal, he's a liberal mayor, it was meant to be read as this expression of care toward the Black community, right? That must be expressed by a caring white liberal. Of course, organizers, family members of people who had been killed by police officers, many organizers in the Black community had been talking about the value of and the love and worth of their family members and community members for some time. So it's not as if he was the first person to notice. So this claim that he was the first person to notice that Black Lives Matter struck us as being something that we really needed to pay attention to, in large part because of the ways in which it was helping to consolidate an additional expansion of policing within Milwaukee. A lot of it hinging on this particular zip code, 53206, which we look at as it could be a particular example of territorial stigmatization, right? So we decided as geographers to take on this concept, territorial stigmatization. Does it work within the United States context? And so one of the elements of, I won't detail there are different versions of the concept that we found. A couple of the elements of the concept that stood out to us was one, a break from the industrial city to post-industrial cities. And second, that there was somewhat of a disconnect between poverty and racialization, and that one of the strong elements of the concept is racialization. And so for us, we wondered, as white women living within a segregated city, where discussions of racism are already euphemized around terms like 53206, whether or not adding another layer of euphemism to a discussion that's already euphemized to the degree that poverty, race, and other factors get talked about as cofactors, but unrelated to processes of racialized capitalism, that are accumulating wealth in the surrounding suburbs of, and power in the surrounding suburbs of Milwaukee, right? So for us, we tried on the term, we tried on the concept, and we found that we remained much more fulfilled, maybe is the word. We found much more explanatory power in the traditions of thinking, drawing out of what I call the Ruth Wilson Gilmore School of Geography, which is to say political economy of race, and the Black radical tradition as a particular formation. So then from the works of Cedric Robinson, from the Black feminist work of Catherine McKittrick, who has been mentioned earlier, from the work of Clyde Woods, from the work of Laura Polito. And so for us, these questions of racialization that are discussed more in symbolic terms, as we saw it, with the concept of territorial stigmatization, are not just symbolic. They are material forces that shape people's lives, that shape particular neighborhoods, investments and disinvestments in different places. And so that's where it is that we came to sort of conclude that we would continue with the kinds of theory, pardon me, that we were working on. So I think that this question then of the political economy of stigma and the racial economy, we could say, of stigma, I think that that term stigma certainly gets circulated within the Milwaukee context. People talk about stigmatized neighborhoods and what it means to fight against, right? The idea of particular neighborhoods being stigmatized. But how is it that we cannot have a conversation about structural racism and white supremacy, right? So in the end, part of what we fear is that then by not being able to have the more direct conversations around the structural violence and direct violence of racial capitalism and white supremacy, that we can have both conservatives and liberals effectively agreeing to increase more policing, and at the same time, while they might have differences in terms of political policies that they might advocate for, what remains is a continued disinvestment in 53206, right? Even if there could be a patina of some political difference between the Democratic and the Republican parties. So I'll leave it there.
We're going to end this bit on Stephen, who's going to start us off with some reflections.
Thank you. I'm sure some of you, or many of you, have seen a New Yorker cartoon, I think, where a man is sitting opposite a woman at a dinner table, and the man has a glass of wine in his hand, and he's saying to the woman, "Let me interrupt your expertise with my confidence." And this situation is a little bit like that, but with the quirky twist that the Sociological Review likes, because I'm effectively being asked to interrupt these authors' knowledge and expertise, but with a distinct lack of confidence in being able to do justice to their work. So please bear with me. In my defence, I think even given an hour or 2 hours, it would kind of be difficult to do justice to the full range of what they've produced. I'll start by thanking Imogen and Tom for the invitation to say a few words about the monograph. I think the monograph in itself and the invitation to me is a very good example of the support that they offer to colleagues. They don't just talk the talk, they walk the walk, I think, and they've certainly been very helpful and supportive of me in a very short sociological career, so thank you, I appreciate it. I guess in their role as editors, they probably hope that the total of the parts would be at least equal. That the total of the monograph will be at least equal to the sum of its parts, yes. And I think that certainly is the case. The different chapters work very well together, so Tom and Imogen, again, deserve credit for that. But also the individual authors, a lot of the papers talk explicitly across to each other, and sometimes kind of more implied. The end result, therefore, is a really, really valuable contribution to contemporary sociological thought. All of the chapters interrogate the cultural and political economy of stigma, as we heard, how it functions as a form of power, very often as a form of state power, And they examine issues around stigma that have been under-researched or have been largely taken for granted for too long, such as the processes and mechanisms by which it's produced, the spaces in which it's produced, who produces it, who's involved in the production, and who benefits from it, and in what ways. The monograph addresses the excessively individualistic focus of much stigma research and instead examines the relational aspects of stigma production and its consequences in a variety of ways. In doing so, the monograph absolutely achieves its aim of reconceptualizing stigma in a way that can assist in understanding contemporary issues of inequality and injustice. And again, it's full of papers that are demonstrably alive, if you think about the discussion from the opening plenary yesterday. It also stays true to the Sociological Review's manifesto pledge. I've been reading it, but I can't remember it. To be responsive to what can be opened up conceptually and practically, and about what can be thought differently. It certainly does that. I think this conference that's about undisciplining and challenging some of the presumed mainstreams of sociological thought, some of its geographical assumptions and disciplinary hierarchies, is a very, very appropriate place to launch the monograph because it does all of these things and more. However, I think it's not a bad however, don't worry. However, I think what's very interesting is it does all of this, but by using core sociological tools and practices and techniques and methods. There's a variety of traditional methods, variety of different traditional perspectives, studying up as well as studying down, as you've heard, looking backstage and sideways in order to understand the front and centre, and drawing on a wide range of sources, including archival research, documents, primary evidence, empirical work and media analyses, and much, much more. There's a real range of methodologies and sources drawn upon. It highlights the breadth and depth of good sociological inquiry. Political sociology is featured very strongly. Again, it was mentioned yesterday that the role of the state is under-researched and under-theorised. Not in this monograph. That the role of the state, the neoliberal state in particular, is central to almost all of the papers, and the links between financial capitalism, racial capitalism, and social or public policy are expounded throughout the collection. And again, so it leads to a really rich analysis of the political and cultural economy of stigma. The papers also cover medical sociology, a sociology of public policy and its implementation, historical sociology, empirical work, as well as more theoretical papers. It's also got a sociology of the fat cats in Kirstein's paper rather than for the fat cats. I'm tempted to try and tell you that it includes spatial sociology, but I think that's what most people call geography. There's a kind of a strong geographical thread coming through. Interestingly, a kind of a wide range of social theorists are drawn on, but some of the old faces, such as Bauman, Goffman, Bourdieu, and Wacquant, are in there, which I think is very interesting as well. And again, as well as it also addresses kind of issues and topics of classic sociological concern. Stigma itself is a very obvious one, but as we've heard, poverty, race, class, disability in Graham Scambler's paper, the importance of place, the importance of housing is a key thread throughout, which I thought was very interesting, and not just from the UK perspective. But the relational aspects of social life and the relation between the micro and the macro are all in there. So I think in some way it serves as a very good reminder that even if we do want to have conversations from the edges and extend the sociological and do and think things differently, some of the core aspects of sociological thinking and some relatively mainstream approaches and theorists have a lot to offer in facilitating those discussions. So I just want to pick up on three threads that intrigued me and interested me as I was reading the chapter. Some of you, I'm sure, will have made some of the same links that I have, having heard the summaries. Two of these relate to sections of the book as they're laid out. So the first section of the book is living with stigma, and the second section is around territorial stigma. So I want to talk about the importance of temporal aspects and in the production of stigma and the resistance of it. I also want to talk about some of the spatial aspects. So I want to talk about spatial aspects first, because I think that the temporal aspects will help lead into the third thing that I want to pick up on, which is the extent to which all of the papers, I think, more or less talk about collective resistance to stigma, which I think we haven't really discussed in detail, and I thought was really, really interesting. So in terms of spatial aspects, the territorial stigmatization section obviously puts place and the symbolic importance of place in the centre of analysis. Tom Slater's chapter focuses on the semantic battering ram of the term the sinker state. Kirstein's includes the myth of the red zone no-go area. Xiao's and Virgilio's focus on the issue of spatial inequalities and housing provision following the coronation revolution in Portugal in 1974. And Jenna and Anne's paper brings, I think, a fascinating discussion of race, space, poverty, politics and policing and the way that they all kind of merge or collide together. Important spatial aspects, however, can be found in other chapters. Imogen starts her chapter with Joseph McNeil's journey from New York to Greenborough and the way he was treated differently at different stops along the way, which led to him being part of the Greenborough Four, sitting at the whites-only counter in Woolworths. And other civil rights activists in some of the places that she mentioned on buses, swimming pools, deciding to be where they were not allowed to be, where they were not supposed to be. And Imogen quotes Stokely Carmichael in stating that he was black and he was human and therefore he had a right to be in any public place. It's very kind of powerful. Tracy uses the location Grenfell disaster as a case study of the stigmatized position and othering of people living in tower blocks, which often used as shorthand or stigmatizing shorthand for social housing, something that Tom picks up on as well. And looks at that both prior to the fire and in the aftermath of it, including, as she mentioned, the efforts to block residents from using or living in, even temporarily, empty properties nearby. But also the location of the inquiry in the palatial De Vere Grand Connaught rooms in Covent Garden, where there were chandeliers and where many of the residents were explicitly made to feel out of place and uncomfortable. Lisa's paper usually discusses children who are not with their parents, who have been removed from their parents and not where they are expected to be. The parents don't know where they are. And the absence of children from one space, I guess, you know, kind of from the place where you were expecting what Gotham would have been called a normal family or the normals, and their insertion into another space in the care of the state is the source of their stigma. Danya Keane, Amy Smoyer and Kim Blankenship, who aren't here today, demonstrate brilliantly the myriad ways that stigma operates and is unfolded as it's enacted across different spaces and contexts surrounding the provision of housing for people who've previously been in prison in the US. These spaces include kind of legislative spaces, policy spaces, the actions of housing officials and landlords, and stigmatized individuals themselves. One very quick example I thought was excellent. Gary, a 54-year-old research participant who did not use drugs, went to Narcotics Anonymous meetings as a way to certify his commitment to rehabilitation and deservingness of housing. He wanted to be seen in the places where people go in order to shed the stigma that he was associated with. Joanna's paper highlights a portrayal of people with dementia as people who are not here or who are viewed as being elsewhere, and the depiction of them as monsters or zombies suggests that they're not of this world. There was this otherworldliness, I thought, that came through. So, yeah, I'm at danger in stating the obvious, but there was a real significance of places and spaces, both in the production of stigma, but also in its resistance. In terms of the temporal aspects, again, I think this is, along with space, an issue, a topic that's run through some of the sessions and some of the discussions I've heard over the past couple of days. And again, I'm at risk of stating the obvious, but stigma isn't just about a spoiled identity. I think it's about a continuously spoiling identity that doesn't just relate to events from the past, but affects and saturates the present and also has implications for future opportunities and plans. One of my favourite Bourdieu quotes, just to chuck it in there, I'd be doing myself a disservice if I didn't, is the separation of sociology and history is a disastrous division and one totally devoid of epistemological justification. All sociology should be historical and all history sociological. And again, a lot of the papers kind of use or highlight temporal aspects in order to examine stigma. Imogen goes back to the early 1960s when Goffman was writing to understand the wider socio-political context. Danya Keane, Amy Smoyer and Kim Blankenship highlight how the past affects not just the present but also hopes and aspirations for the future. They talk of a structural stigma, but they could also talk of a structuring stigma as well that kind of goes with people. Lisa's work focused on the futures, the haunted future of these mothers, and kind of she highlights how everyday life is saturated with state power due to what she was talking about, the reporting and the access restrictions, and the potential, the future potential for any more children to be removed by the state or more likely to be removed. I think Jenna and Anne's paper argues, again, brilliantly, that territorial stigmatisation is a neutralising term which militates against the grounded histories and contemporary workings of racial capitalism. And this is one of the standout moments of the monograph to me, and opens up real future possibilities to interrogate territorial stigma and the way it has been deployed in many cases as a distinct process separate from other social, political and economic contexts and developments. I'm nearly there. Joanna highlights the living death nature of how dementia is portrayed. And again, she highlights how people experiencing dementia are cast as having previously failed to prepare for the future. I thought this was really interesting. In Joanna's words, they did not respond to the call to master their futures. And in this, and in a discussion around a programme about the early detection of dementia, I saw real resonance with the problematic early intervention agenda at the opposite end of the life course that Val Gillies, Ros Edwards and Nicola Horsley have written about and will be talking about tomorrow morning, about kind of parents being blamed for not wiring or rewiring their children's brains effectively at a very early age. Tom's article maps the trajectory or journey of the concept of the stinker state really well, from kind of initial discussions about it to the way it is following David Cameron's speech in 2016. So it's become an official concept. And again, Zhao's and Virgilio's paper highlights the importance of time and critical temporal moments of revolution and political instability in rejecting and resisting stigma. Finally, yeah, I'd be interested, I'll try and get in there early with a question. The extent to which discussions of collective resistance were explicitly asked for or in the monograph, because I think it's really interesting. And I may have missed it, it may have been a certain thing, but almost all of the papers discuss and kind of very positively discuss opportunities to disrupt stigma. So the introduction to the monograph highlights the work of a group of Canadian scholars and activists who devised a project called Hands Off Our Stories in response to stigmatising and individualising depictions of people experiencing mental distress. Imogen Tyler mentioned Greensboro 4 and other students and civil rights activists. Lisa highlights collective resistance from a range of women's groups, mothers living apart from their children, the mothers of Plaza de Mayo, and women at Yarl's Wood Immigration Removal Centre. The resistance to what happened and continues to happen at Grenfell is ongoing. Graham Scambler's paper, which I haven't talked about a lot, highlights opportunities and strategies, what he calls a plethora of resistance activities to resist the weaponising of stigma by the powerful, with a particular focus on disability policy and practice. Zhao and Virgilio pay attention to the collective work that was undertaken to refuse and invert the stigma attached to neighbourhoods in Porto in the 1970s. Jenna and Anne highlight the Coalition for Justice that was launched by the family of a murdered black man, Dontre Hamilton, that echoed previous efforts of collective organising in the 1980s. And Kirstine talks about the Games Monitor. Didn't say too much about that, I don't think, but a collection of scholars and activists who documented some of the decision-making around the Games and some of the financial flows that enabled and supported some of her work, but also I think highlights the difficulty of some collective resistance. People didn't want to be the grumpy, negative people who who saw through the rhetoric of the Games. I think there's relevance with the Great Exhibition of the North, which we're being told is wonderful for us, and it is very problematic, but it's very difficult to be cynical and negative or critical about that. So, in conclusion, I'm going to borrow in a moment a phrase from Joanna's chapter, which I thought was excellent. But I think up until now, most sociologists or scholars from other disciplines would be pointed towards or would head towards Goffman's work on stigma if they were interested in the subject. And they would probably feel on relatively safe ground that that was an appropriate place to start. I think the publication of this monograph will rupture that certainty. It's a phrase that Joanna draws on. I think it casts doubt on that position of stigma as Goffman, as the go-to paper. That's not to say that we should, kind of completely discard Goffman or that he wasn't perfect. And I'm not arguing that this is the new Goffman. It's not. because I'm not saying this flippantly, but potentially from a sociological perspective, it's more important, I think. It's more inherently sociological than Goffman's work, because it raises questions rather than provides answers, I think, which is, it provides tools rather than finished products. And again, there is an uncertainty as a result of this work, I think. I think there's no higher praise for a sociological endeavour than stating that it forces you to doubt and to question, to open up and to think differently about a subject, a concept, or a body of work that has been largely, if not entirely, taken for granted for a long period of time. I think one of the things that I really enjoyed reading, things that I enjoyed about reading the monograph, was that I learned a lot. And I think we all do lots of different jobs, but lots of us are researchers or teachers or educators, and we are expected to pass on our knowledge, I guess. But I think most of us will, if not all, will all see ourselves as scholars or learners in some way, and I certainly do, and there is a lot that I learn, and I think that we can all learn, not just from the individual chapters in the monograph, but from the collection as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you.